When I was a kid, my dad was my hero. After my mom died, he remarried and created a perfect new family, one that I wasn't a part of. He told me I was a financial burden, that I was crazy for questioning his money, and threw me out with nothing. For 15 years I thought he was just a cruel father. But when he came back demanding I pay for the life he built on my stolen inheritance, I started digging. This isn't just a revenge story. It's a deep dive into a financial crime investigation that exposed my father's darkest secrets and brought his entire empire crashing down. It's a story about gaslighting, narcissism, and the moment a victim decides to become the victor. This is the story of how I took back my life. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch. The polished mahogany of my front door felt like a barrier between two worlds. On my side, there was the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the scent of fresh coffee, and the ordered peace I had spent 15 years clawing my way toward. On the other side, standing on my porch under the manicured glow of the landscape lighting, was the ghost of a life I'd barely survived. My father, Richard, and his wife, Clara. They looked older, of course. The sharp, handsome lines of my father's face had softened into a geography of fine lines and strained entitlement. Clara, ever the porcelain doll, looked brittle, her smile stretched as thin as a crack in fine china. They hadn't called. They hadn't written. They had simply materialized as if summoned by a nightmare I thought I'd finally outgrown. I opened the door but didn't move. I filled the doorway, a human wall. "And surely, Clara." I kept my voice flat, a calm lake over a trench of boiling resentment. "Alex, darling," Clara cooed, her voice the same cloying honey and venom mixture I remembered. She took a step forward, expecting an embrace, or at the very least an invitation inside. I didn't budge. Richard, ever the master of cutting through pleasantries, cleared his throat. "Alex, it's important. Alex, it's important." "I can't imagine what we have to talk about," I said. The quiet street in my affluent Boston suburb was silent, save for the distant chirp of crickets. It was a peaceful sound I'd come to cherish, and their presence felt like a violation of it. "Don't be difficult," Richard snapped, his charm already wearing thin. "This isn't a social call. We're here because we have a problem, a family problem. You stopped being my family the day you put my belongings in trash bags on the curb," I replied, the words tasting like ash. His face tightened. "That's ancient history. You're an adult now, a successful one, from the looks of this place." He gestured vaguely at the two-story colonial behind me. "John, we heard you made partner. Your Aunt Celia is quite the gossip." "And so, this is a fundraising visit," I said, a bitter laugh almost escaping my lips. "Let me guess. The twins, Dylan and Sophie, are ready for college, and the trust fund you were always bragging about has suddenly run dry." Clara flinched, a flicker of genuine panic in her eyes before it was replaced by practiced indignation. "How can you be so callous? This is about your brother and sister. They've been accepted to wonderful schools, Dartmouth for Dylan, NYU for Sophie. We're so proud." "And good for them," I said. "I wish them the best." "Wishing isn't going to pay their tuition," Richard said, his voice lowering into the register he used for closing deals, a blend of intimidation and supposed reason. "Look, we've had some setbacks. The market has been volatile. A few investments went south. It's a temporary cash flow issue." I just stared at him. The man who lectured me for years about fiscal responsibility, who called me a leech for needing money for school books, was standing on my doorstep talking about a cash flow issue. The long-term audacity of it was breathtaking. It was the kind of gall that could power a small city. "And you want me," I said slowly, letting each word hang in the humid evening air, "to fix it for you." "Oh, gosh, son," Clara whispered, as if the word itself was a magic spell. "You have a responsibility." "My only responsibility was to myself," I shot back, my voice finally cracking with the heat I'd been suppressing. "A responsibility I took very seriously after you made it abundantly clear that no one else would. You threw me out. You told me I was on my own. You cut me off from my mother's inheritance, telling me it was all gone, that it had been absorbed by family expenses. And then too I did what you told me to do. I made it on my own. And now you have the nerve to stand here and ask me to pay for the children you chose over me? Oh, you're twisting things, Alex. Richard said, his face flushing. It was the gaslighter's classic defense. It was time for you to stand on your own 2 feet. We were teaching you a valuable lesson. If anything, you should be thanking us. That tough love is the reason you have all this. He swept his hand again, dismissing my entire life's work as a byproduct of his cruelty. That was the moment something inside me didn't just break, it atomized. The years of pain, of self-doubt, of wondering if I was the crazy one, if I was the ungrateful, burdensome child he'd always painted me as, it all coalesced into a single sharp point of clarity. Thank you? I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Let me tell you what I have to thank you for. I thank you for the nights I spent sleeping in my car because I couldn't afford rent and a full course load. I thank you for the crippling student loan debt I had to take on because you refused to even co-sign, claiming you were over-leveraged. I thank you for the years of therapy it took to undo the belief that I was worthless because my own father treated me like a line-item expense he couldn't wait to cut. So yes, thank you for everything. Clara began to cry, but they were crocodile tears, deployed for maximum effect. And he's always been so dramatic, she whimpered to Richard. I'm not giving you a single cent, I said, the words as solid as granite. Not for the twins' college, not for your cash flow issues, not for anything. You made your bed with my mother's money. Now you can lie in it. Richard's face morphed from strained patience to pure, undiluted rage. After everything we did for you, you did nothing for me, I interrupted, stepping back and putting my hand on the door. You did things to me. Don't get off my property. This isn't over, Alex, he snarled, jabbing a finger in my direction. Family takes care of family. Then you should have thought of that 15 years ago, I said, and I closed the door on their stunned, furious faces. I leaned against the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs, the sound of their footsteps retreating down my stone walkway. The quiet of my house rushed back in, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged. That confrontation hadn't brought closure. It had lit a fuse. Standing there in the home I had built for myself, I realized I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was a forensic accountant. And my father had just made the colossal mistake of reminding me that he had secrets. My life didn't begin with shadows. For the first 10 years, it was all sunlight. It was my mom, Sarah, and me against the world. My father, Richard, was a rising star at a boutique investment firm in downtown Boston. He was handsome, ambitious, and utterly devoted to my mother, or so it seemed. They were the golden couple. Our house in Brookline wasn't as grand as the one I lived in now, but it was filled with laughter. My mom was a landscape architect, and our backyard was her canvas, a wild, beautiful tangle of climbing roses and hydrangeas the color of the summer sky. She smelled like potting soil and Chanel No. 5. Richard was my hero. He taught me how to ride a bike, how to skip stones across the Charles River, and how to read the stock market pages in the newspaper, explaining it all with a patient, easy confidence. It's all about patterns, Alex, he'd say, tapping a column of numbers. You just have to know what to look for. He was a god in a tailored suit, and I was his adoring disciple. The first shadow fell when I was 10. It started with a cough my mom couldn't shake. Then came the fatigue, the doctor's appointments she'd come back from with a strained brightness that didn't reach her eyes. Pancreatic cancer. The words were clinical, cold, and they sucked all the sunlight out of our lives. The next 2 years were a blur of hospital visits, hushed conversations, and the sterile smell of antiseptic that clung to everything. Richard was a rock. He was there, holding her hand, managing the bills, comforting me, being the perfect, grieving husband. I watched my vibrant, life-loving mother fade into a fragile, paper-thin version of herself. She died on a rainy Tuesday in April. I was 12. The grief was a physical thing, a heavy cloak I couldn't take off. Richard and I were adrift in our big, quiet house. He tried, he made my breakfast, he checked my homework, but the laughter was gone. The house felt haunted by her absence. Then, about 6 months after the funeral, Clara appeared. She was a colleague of my father's, an events coordinator for the firm. She was beautiful in a way that was the complete opposite of my mother. Where my mom was warm, earthy, and natural, Clara was sleek, polished, and cool. She started coming over for dinner, bringing perfectly arranged platters of food from expensive delis. She talked to my father in low, soothing tones about mergers and portfolios, a language I didn't understand. She was kind to me, but it was a studied kindness. She'd ask about my day at school with the same detached interest one might show a neighbor's pet. I hated her on sight. I felt it as a deep, primal betrayal of my mom. But Richard was different around her. He smiled again, a real smile. A small part of the light came back into his eyes. I was so desperate for him to be happy again that I swallowed my resentment and tried to accept her. I told myself it was what my mom would have wanted. They were married a year after my mother's death, in a small, elegant ceremony at a country club. I was the ring bearer, dressed in an itchy suit that felt like a costume. I stood there, watching my father slide a ring onto Clara's finger in the same spot where my mother's ring used to be, and the heavy cloak of grief felt like it was suffocating me. The move to the new house came quickly. It was a massive, ostentatious place in Weston, one of Boston's wealthiest suburbs. It was Clara's choice. Our old house, she'd said, held too many sad memories. What she meant was it held too many memories of my mother. Every trace of Sarah was systematically erased. Her photos were put into storage. Her beloved wild garden was bulldozed and replaced with a sterile, perfectly manicured lawn and geometric boxwoods. My father didn't protest. He seemed relieved. It was in this new cold house that the gaslighting began, subtle at first. I'd mention a memory of my mom, a trip we took to Cape Cod, and Clara would smile sweetly and say, "Oh honey, are you sure?" Richard told me they never went to the Cape that year. Richard would back her up. "On your memory's playing tricks on you, bud. We went to Vermont. I knew we'd gone to the Cape. I could still taste the salt on my lips, feel the sand in my shoes." But they were a united front. Two adults telling a grieving child that his own mind was unreliable. After a while, you start to believe it. Then Clara got pregnant, with twins. The announcement was made over a formal dinner. Richard was beaming, popping a bottle of champagne that cost more than my monthly allowance. "A new beginning," he declared, raising his glass. "To our new family, the word hung in the air. But it was clear I wasn't really a part of it. I was a relic from his old life, a living reminder of the woman they were so desperate to forget. When Dylan and Sophie were born, I vanished. All of Richard and Clara's energy, attention, and resources were funneled into these two perfect new babies. I became a ghost in my own home. My needs were an inconvenience, my presence an afterthought. The financial manipulation started around the time I turned 15. It was insidious. Richard would sit me down for money talks. He'd show me spreadsheets with intimidating graphs and columns of figures. "And you see, Alex," he'd say, his tone grave, "running a household of this size is incredibly expensive. The twins have needs. Your private school tuition is a significant drain." He started talking about my mother's inheritance. After she died, I knew she had left a substantial trust for me. It was supposed to be for my education and to help me start my life. Richard was the executor. "The market took a huge hit after she passed," he'd explain, his expression a mask of paternal concern. "A lot of the portfolio was in high-risk tech stocks. It's not what it once was, I'm afraid. I've had to liquidate most of it to cover family expenses." He made it sound like my existence was bankrupting them. He'd sigh dramatically over the cost of my hockey equipment or a school trip. Clara would chime in, "Shani just wants you to be more mindful, Alex. We all have to make sacrifices." This, while she was driving a new Mercedes and wearing designer clothes. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. They lived in a palace, took lavish vacations to St. Bart's, and yet I was the financial black hole. I was a kid. I didn't have the language or the confidence to call him a liar. I just felt a deep, burrowing shame. I started to believe I was a burden. Learned helplessness took root. I stopped asking for things. I wore shoes until they had holes in them. I tried to make myself smaller, cheaper. One day, I found an old bank statement of my mom's tucked away in a book she'd given me. It was from just before she got sick. The balance in her investment account was staggering, far more than Richard had ever let on. I worked up the courage to ask him about it. I found him in his home office, a room paneled in dark wood that always smelled of leather and hubris. I held out the statement. It looks like there was a lot more money than you said." He took the paper from me, his eyes scanning it. He didn't even flinch. He just leaned back in his chair and gave me a look of profound disappointment, as if I'd just failed the most important test of my life. Alex," he said, shaking his head slowly. You don't understand how these things work. This is a snapshot in time. Before taxes, before the market crash, before your mother's medical bills, which were astronomical. He spun a web of financial jargon, capital gains, estate taxes, market volatility, that left my head spinning. He made me feel stupid, naive, and greedy for even asking. You're seeing what you want to see, he said, his voice soft but sharp. You're looking for something to be angry about. I'm doing my best to manage what little is left for the good of this entire family. And frankly, I'm hurt that you would question my integrity like this. He turned me around so expertly that by the end of the conversation I was apologizing to him. I left his office feeling ashamed and confused, the bank statement crumpled in his trash can. That was his genius. He could look you right in the eye, tell you the sky was green, and do it with such conviction that you'd walk away wondering why you'd ever thought it was blue. The final act came a month after my 18th birthday. They sat me down in the formal living room, the one with the silk curtains and the furniture no one ever sat on. It was a tribunal. Alex, Richard began, his tone somber. Clara and I have been talking. It's time. You're a man now. We've given you a wonderful home, a great education, and every advantage for 18 years. But we can't afford to support you any longer. The twins are our priority now. It's time for you to go out into the world and make your own way. Clara nodded, dabbing at a non-existent tear. We believe in you, darling. This is the best thing for you. It will build character. It wasn't a discussion, it was a verdict. They weren't asking me to leave, they were telling me. I was being evicted from my own life. They told me the last of my mother's trust was gone, eaten up by the cost of raising me. They handed me $500 in cash. A little something to get you started, Richard said magnanimously, and told me I needed to be out by the end of the week. I didn't fight. I didn't argue. What was the point? The learned helplessness was complete. I felt a strange, hollow calm. I went upstairs and packed a duffel bag and a couple of boxes. Photos of my mom, some books, old yearbooks. As I was leaving, I walked past the twins' room. They were 6 years old, sleeping peacefully in their matching beds, oblivious. They weren't the enemy, they were just the reason. My Aunt Celia, my mother's younger sister, was my only refuge. When I showed up on her doorstep in Cambridge with my life in 2 boxes, her face was a storm of fury and heartbreak. She took me in without a second's hesitation. That son of a bitch, she seethed, pacing her small living room. I knew it. I knew it. I knew he'd do this. Your mother. She would be horrified. Celia didn't have much. She was a high school art teacher living in a small apartment. But she gave me her spare room, she fed me, and most importantly, she gave me back a piece of my sanity. Don't you ever believe you were a burden, Alex, she'd say, her eyes flashing. And you. Richard stole that from you. Richard stole that from you. I don't know how, but he did. Her belief in me was the first crack in the foundation of shame Richard had built. College was a brutal grind. I got into Boston University, but without a cosigner for loans and with no family contribution, I was on my own. I worked 3 jobs: barista, library clerk, late-night food delivery. I lived on ramen and caffeine. There were weeks I was so tired I'd fall asleep in the library with my face pressed against a textbook. I majored in business, but I found myself drawn to one specific field: forensic accounting. It was a strange choice, but it felt right. It was the art of finding the story in the numbers, of uncovering the truth hidden in plain sight. It was a way to understand the weapon that had been used against me. I wanted to understand how Richard had done it. I wanted to be able to look at a spreadsheet and see not just numbers, but lies. I excelled. The patterns Richard had once shown me in the stock market pages were nothing compared to the patterns of fraud I learned to identify. It was my armor. I graduated with honors and a mountain of debt. I took a job at a mid-level accounting firm and poured every ounce of myself into it. I worked longer hours than anyone. I took the most complex, thankless cases. I was driven by a quiet, burning fire. I wasn't just building a career, I was building a fortress. Over the years I moved up. I paid off my loans. I started my own firm with a few trusted colleagues, specializing in complex financial fraud cases. We became known for our meticulous, relentless work. We took on corporations hiding debt, executives embezzling funds, and sophisticated Ponzi schemes. I became the man people hired to find the truth my father had taught me to doubt. By the time I was 33, I was more than successful. I was wealthy. I had the big house in the suburbs, the nice car, the life Richard and Clara had always worshipped. But I never flaunted it. I lived quietly. I had my Aunt Celia and a small circle of friends. I had finally found peace. And then they showed up on my doorstep, ringing the bell and threatening to burn it all down. But as I stood there after shutting the door on them, I realized they hadn't come to burn my life down. They had come to deliver a gift. They had reminded me of who I was and what I could do. The scared, confused boy was gone. In his place was a man who knew exactly how to read the patterns, and I was about to read my father's life like an open book. The night after their visit, I didn't sleep. I sat in my home office, a room that was the antithesis of my father's, all clean lines, modern glass and organized systems, and let the fury simmer. It wasn't a hot, blinding rage anymore. It was cold, sharp, and focused. The confrontation on my porch hadn't just been an insulting plea for money, it was a declaration of war. Richard had shown his hand. He was desperate. And desperate men, I knew from my professional life, are always sloppy. For 15 years, a part of me had accepted his narrative, or at least, the possibility that it was partially true. Maybe the market had been bad. Maybe my mother's medical bills were astronomical. I had been too young, too grief-stricken, too emotionally beaten down to fight back. The gaslighting had been so effective that it left a permanent residue of self-doubt. Did I remember correctly? Was I being unfair? Was he just a flawed man who made some selfish choices? No. That confrontation wiped the slate clean. The man who stood on my porch, dripping with entitlement and disdain, was not a flawed father. He was a predator. And he had come back to the well one too many times. My revenge wouldn't be emotional. Yelling matches and slammed doors were his arena, not mine. My battlefield was the quiet, undeniable world of numbers, of documents, of money trails. I was going to use the skills I had honed in the ashes of the life he torched to meticulously, professionally, and legally dismantle him. I wasn't going to just get justice for the boy he threw away. I was going to get justice for my mother. The first step was a deep breath and a clear plan. This couldn't be a personal vendetta, it had to be a professional investigation. I had to treat Richard and his company, Weston Capital Management, as if they were any other client file. I created a new, encrypted folder on my server. The project name, Project Phoenix. I started with the public domain. It's amazing what you can find if you know where to look. I ran a comprehensive search on Richard and Clara. Property records, corporate filings, political donations, social media. Their life was an open book of curated perfection. Photos from charity galas, grinning alongside local politicians. Clara's Instagram was a monument to conspicuous consumption. A new boat named the Clara Tie, ski trips to Aspen, summers in the Hamptons. It was a lifestyle that screamed liquidity and success. But Richard's claim of a temporary cash flow issue was a crack in that glossy facade. A man with this kind of wealth doesn't get rattled by a few tuition bills. Unless the wealth isn't real. The first major red flag came from the property records. The Weston Mansion, which I knew they'd bought for around $3 million 15 years ago, had been refinanced. Not once, but 3 times in the last 5 years. Each time they had pulled out significant equity. This wasn't the behavior of someone with a healthy portfolio. It was the behavior of someone desperately trying to stay afloat, using their home like a personal ATM. Next, I turned to Weston Capital Management. Richard had built a reputation as a boutique wealth manager for the Boston elite. His clients were old money families, successful surgeons, retired executives. He promised steady, reliable returns, positioning himself as a safe harbor in a volatile market. I pulled the firm's public filings with the SEC. On the surface, everything looked clean. Assets under management were listed at an impressive 9 figures. But I knew that these filings could be manipulated. I needed to get inside. I couldn't subpoena his records without tipping him off, so I had to find another way. I started by building a profile of his employees. I found a junior analyst who had left Weston Capital less than a year ago. His name was Kevin. His LinkedIn profile showed he was young, ambitious, and now working at a much larger, more reputable firm. He was exactly the kind of person who might be disillusioned with a former employer. I reached out to him under the guise of professional networking. I took him to lunch at a high-end steakhouse downtown, A place where a young analyst would feel important. I didn't mention Richard or my relationship to him. I just talked about the industry, about his career goals. After an hour of building rapport, I casually steered the conversation. "I've heard good things about Weston Capital," I said, sipping my water. "Richard has a solid reputation. Must have been a great place to start." Kevin's smile tightened just a fraction, but I saw it. "It was an experience," he said, choosing his words carefully. Just an experience?" I pressed gently. "I'm always looking for talent." "What was the culture like there?" She hesitated, then seemed to decide I was safe. "It was strange," he said, his voice dropping. "It's a very small operation. Just Richard, a couple of senior guys who have been with him forever, and Clara, who handles client relations, which mostly means planning parties. There's no real oversight. Richard handles all the trading himself. Everything is siloed. We never saw the full picture of any client's portfolio." "That's not unusual for a small firm," I offered, playing devil's advocate. No, but this was different," Kevin insisted. The client statements. They were all generated internally. They didn't come directly from the brokerage house. Richard said it was to provide a more holistic, user-friendly summary. But I once saw a client get an official statement from a brokerage by mistake, and the numbers didn't match what was on the Weston Capital statement he'd been sent a week earlier. The real account had significantly less money in it. Bingo! My heart started to beat a little faster. This was the cornerstone of a classic Ponzi scheme. Fake statements to lull investors into a false sense of security while their money is being misappropriated. "And Sean, what did you do?" I asked. "I asked one of the senior guys about it," Kevin said, looking down at his plate. "He basically told me to shut up and mind my own business. He said Richard had a unique algorithm and that the brokerage statements didn't reflect the real-time value. Sounded like BS. I started looking for a new job the next day. The whole place felt off, like a house of cards. After lunch, I went back to my office and the pieces started snapping into place. The lavish lifestyle, the constant need for new cash from refinancing his house, the internally generated statements, it all pointed to the same ugly conclusion. Richard wasn't an investor, he was a con man. He was likely using new investor money to pay returns to the older investors, all while siphoning off millions to fund his and Clara's extravagant life. The setbacks he mentioned weren't due to a volatile market, they were due to the scheme reaching its breaking point. A Ponzi scheme requires a constant influx of new money to survive. He was running out of runway. The tuition bills for the twins weren't a minor problem, they were a symptom of a terminal disease. He needed my money, a huge, clean chunk of it, to plug a hole in a dam that was about to burst. And then I thought about my mother's trust. The story he'd spun about a market crash and high-risk stocks. It was all a lie. He hadn't lost her money, he had stolen it. It was likely the seed money for his entire fraudulent enterprise. He had used my mother's legacy, the money meant to secure my future, to build a fantasy life with his new family. A life built on a foundation of theft and lies. The rage that filled me was pure ice. This was bigger than just getting back at him for throwing me out. This was about a crime. A massive, devastating crime that had likely ruined the lives of dozens of families who had trusted him. My personal grievance had just become a public service. Now that I had a working theory, I needed irrefutable proof. I hired a private investigator, a former FBI agent I'd worked with on previous cases. I gave him a simple task: find me a disgruntled Weston Capital client. Someone who was starting to ask questions. It took him 2 weeks. He found a widow in her late 70s, Mrs. Gable. Her husband had been one of Richard's first clients. She had recently tried to withdraw a large sum for her grandson's medical bills and had been given a series of excuses and delays. She was scared and confused. I approached her through my firm. I didn't tell her about my connection to Richard. I told her we were a firm that specialized in investment fraud and that we had reason to believe there were irregularities at Weston Capital. I offered to review her documents pro bono. She wept with relief and gave me everything. Her file was the Rosetta Stone. For 20 years she had been receiving pristine, professional-looking statements from Weston Capital, showing her portfolio growing at a steady, impressive 8–10% a year. She had also given me the small handful of official brokerage statements she had received over the years, one she had filed away and forgotten about. I spent a weekend locked in my office, cross-referencing every single transaction. The fraud was breathtaking in its simplicity and audacity. When new money came in from an investor, Richard would deposit it into a brokerage account. He would then use that money for two things: paying fake dividends to other investors and transferring huge sums to a series of shell corporations. These corporations, with innocuous names like Atlantic Logistics and Beacon Hill Properties, were registered to post office boxes and had only one director, Clara. He had stolen millions. My mother's money, Mr. Gable's retirement savings, the nest eggs of dozens of families. It was all gone, laundered through Clara's shell companies and spent on cars, boats, jewelry, and a life of utter delusion. He wasn't just a narcissist. He was a sociopath in a bespoke suit. The final piece of the puzzle was my mother's trust. Getting those records was harder. Since I was the beneficiary, I had a legal right to them, but I had to petition the court, a process that would alert Richard. I couldn't risk it, so I went back to my Aunt Celia. I asked her if she had kept any of my mother's old paperwork. We spent a Sunday afternoon in her dusty attic, sifting through boxes of memories. And there, in a folder labeled Estate Planning, we found it. A copy of the original trust document, and more importantly, the name of the law firm that had drafted it. It was a long shot, but I contacted the firm. I explained who I was, and that I had reason to believe the trust had been criminally mismanaged by the executor, Richard. Given the potential for legal exposure on their part, they were surprisingly cooperative. They provided me with a full accounting of the trust's initial value and the subsequent liquidation. As I read the documents, my vision blurred. The trust was worth over $4 million when my mother died. Richard had systematically drained it within 2 years. The liquidation statements were a work of fiction, citing fake market losses and inflated estate expenses. The final withdrawal, a sum of nearly $2 million, was transferred directly to the newly incorporated Weston Capital Management. He had used my inheritance as his startup capital. He had literally built his new life on the bones of his old one. I had it all. The paper trail was undeniable. The fake statements, the shell corporations, the commingling of funds, the theft of my inheritance. It was a slam-dunk federal case. I spent a week compiling my findings into a single, comprehensive dossier. It was over 100 pages long, with exhibits, flowcharts tracing the money, and a detailed narrative of the entire scheme. It was the most important piece of work I had ever done. It was my magnum opus of revenge. I didn't go to the police. This was too big, too complex for local law enforcement. This was a job for the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI. I printed 2 copies of the dossier. I put them in 2 separate courier envelopes, with no return address. One was addressed to the head of enforcement at the UCC's Boston regional office. The other was addressed to the special agent in charge of the Economic Crimes Squad at the local FBI field office. I sent them anonymously. My fingerprints were not on this. My name was not on this. I would be a ghost, just as he had made me a ghost in his life. The system would do the rest. Then I waited. 3 weeks later, on a crisp autumn morning, it happened. I was drinking my coffee and scrolling through the news when the headline jumped out at me. Prominent Boston financier, Richard Lowell, arrested in massive Ponzi scheme. The article was accompanied by a photo of my father being led out of his gleaming office building in handcuffs. His face was a mask of shock and disbelief. Clara was quoted tearfully proclaiming his innocence, calling it a terrible misunderstanding. The article mentioned that the investigation was triggered by a highly detailed anonymous tip. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow, deep sip of my coffee. It was the best I had ever tasted. There was no elation, no fist-pumping victory, just a profound, quiet sense of peace. The scales had been balanced. The truth, the real truth that lived in the numbers, had finally come out. The fallout was spectacular and swift. Richard's assets were frozen. The Weston mansion, the boat, the cars, all seized. Clara was also charged as the director of the shell corporations. The media depicted them as a modern-day Bernie and Ruth Madoff. Their friends vanished. The charity boards they sat on issued statements of condemnation. Their perfect world had evaporated overnight. Richard, facing a mountain of evidence, took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Clara, for her role, got 5. I never spoke to them again. My only contact with that part of my life came from an unexpected source. A few months after the sentencing, I received a carefully worded email from my half-brother, Dylan. He was 19. His life, and his sister Sophie's, had been completely upended. Their college dreams were gone, their family name was a synonym for disgrace, and their parents were in prison. He didn't ask for money. He didn't make excuses for our father. He simply asked if we could talk. He wanted to understand. He said he and Sophie had found some old photo albums in the attic of the rented townhouse they were now living in with a relative. Albums of my mom. They had questions. I hesitated for a long time. I had built my fortress to keep them all out, but Dylan and Sophie weren't them. They were victims too, in a different way. They were raised in a lie, beneficiaries of a crime they knew nothing about. I agreed to meet him for coffee. He was a good kid, quiet and thoughtful, with my father's jawline but my kind eyes. He was angry and lost, and deeply ashamed. He apologized for what our father did to me, to my mother, to everyone. "We grew up thinking you were the bad guy," he admitted, staring into his cup. "Sean, Dad always said you were difficult, ungrateful. He made it sound like you abandoned us." "He was good at creating narratives," I said quietly. That coffee was the first step. It wasn't easy. There were years of poison to overcome, but we kept talking. I told them about our mother, Sarah. I showed them pictures, shared memories, the real memories, the ones Richard and Clara had tried to erase. I was, in a strange way, giving them back a part of their own history that had been stolen from them. I didn't pay for their Dartmouth or NIU tuition. That life was a fantasy built on fraud. But I did help them. I set up a modest educational fund for them, with my own, legally earned money. Enough for them to go to a good state school, to get a real start, free from the shadow of their parents' crimes. I helped them fill out financial aid forms. I became the mentor and provider that our father never truly was for any of us. It was my final act of reclamation. I wasn't just fixing the damage he had done to me, I was fixing the damage he had done to them. I was building something new and honest from the wreckage. My life is quiet now. The fortress walls have come down, replaced by bridges. My Aunt Celia, Dylan, Sophie and I have dinner together once a month. We are a strange, cobbled-together family, bound not by a shared past of happy memories, but by a shared survival of a difficult one. Sometimes I think about my father in his prison cell. I don't feel anger or pity. I feel nothing. He's just a number in a system now, a ghost in a life that moved on without him. He taught me that everything is about patterns. He was right. He just never imagined that one day, I would be the one to read his. He tried to write my story, to define me by my supposed weakness. But in the end, I used my strength, my mind, and his own sins to write the final chapter myself. And in that chapter, I am finally free.